Il est temps maintenant de commencer à vous donner quelques réponses. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir et de vous présenter le professeur Mingron de Rome, de l'Université catholique, donc celle du pape, qui a été l'auteur principal d'une étude très importante, puisque c'est la première fois que de façon classique, c'est-à-dire avec l'evidence-based medicine, au cours d'une étude randomisée, publiée il y a quelques mois seulement, on est au cœur de l'actualité dans le New England Journal of Medicine, on a pu faire la comparaison directe avec randomisation du traitement médical et de différents types de chirurgie. Je crois que c'est un point très important et c'est une étape essentielle dans la compréhension et dans l'efficacité de cette chirurgie. Professeur Mingron, s'il vous plaît, qui nous parlera en anglais, car je pense que nous préférons l'anglais que l'italien. Et donc, même si nous adorons cette langue, je pense que nous la comprenons moins.
Merci François. Let me say that I'm honored to be here today speaking to this prestigious academy. So, unfortunately, diabetes compensation, so glycemic control, is really not so good, as shown by medical therapy, as shown by this study published in 2002, showing that across Europe, only about 30% of diabetic subjects had a good diabetic compensation, having a glycated hemoglobin lower or equal to 6.5%, while the majority of the patients had a decompensated diabetes. As told before by François, the Swedish obesity study was one of the pioneeristic study in showing the effect of bariatric surgery or metabolic surgery on diabetes remission. Till now, there are very few studies comparing the medical therapy with bariatric surgery in a randomized way, and I sincerely hope that in the future some multi-center study may show the effect of bariatric surgery in a larger population and principally the long-term effect and the cardiovascular efficacy of bariatric surgery. However, till now, the first study was published, controlled randomized study, was published by John Dixon in 2008 in JAMA. And 158 subjects with type 2 diabetes were interviewed by telephone, and many of them excluded, 25 excluded, after a brief explanation of the study. And then 130 underwent clinical assessment, and only 60 were randomized 1-to-1 towards medical therapy or laparoscopic gastric bending. In the end, 29 completed the surgical study and 26 the medical study. The primary endpoint of this study was to verify the glycemic control in these two groups at 2 years after randomization. And indeed, the endpoint regarded the glucose control, with the target. The target was a plasma fasting glucose lower than 126 milligram per deciliters, in addition to levels of glycated hemoglobin lower than 6.2%. It's important to stress that this achievement was obtained without the use of oral hypoglycemic agents or insulin. And at baseline, there was no statistical difference between the two arms, I mean the surgical and conventional medical therapy arm, in terms of age, hypertension, number of subjects with a hypertension or metabolic syndrome, and no difference in body mass index and waist-to-hip ratio, so anthropometric characteristics of the subjects or degree of compensation of diabetes. The results obtained at 2 years fulfilled the primary and secondary outcome since there was a drastic improvement of glucose control with a large decrease of glycated hemoglobin. You can see that there was a reduction of about 2 points of HB1C. And also plasma glucose was lowered by about 38%. But just in the surgical arm. Of course, the weight loss was much higher in the patients who underwent gastric bending than the patients who were under conventional medical therapy. And there was also a large reduction of waist circumference and waist to hip ratio. Triglycerides were lowered of about 70%, and HDL cholesterol was increased, while total cholesterol was decreased significantly. This year, in April, we had the chance to publish a paper of ours in the New England Journal of Medicine, together with a study published by Philip Schauer in the same issue of New England Journal of Medicine. The major difference was that the study from Schauer regarded 2 kinds of bariatric surgery, namely sleeve gastrectomy and gastric bypass, and the patients under medical therapy were under a lifestyle modification and intensive medical therapy, while our study regarded biliopancreatic diversion and gastric bypass in comparison with conventional medical therapy. The study of Schauer had as a main primary endpoint the proportion of the patients who reached a level of glycated hemoglobin lower than 6%, with or without medical therapy 1 year after randomization. The inclusion criteria were an age between 20 and 60 years, the presence of frank type 2 diabetes with a glycated hemoglobin higher than 7%, and a large body mass index range from 27 to 43 kilograms per square meter, which means that the patients were overweight or obese or morbidly obese. After a screening of 218 patients at the Cleveland Clinic, 150 were randomized 1:1 to gastric bypass, sleeve gastrectomy, and intensive medical therapy. And at baseline, there was no statistical difference among the 3 arms of the study in anthropometric characteristics and kind of association or complication of diabetes, mainly metabolic syndrome or history of dyslipidemia or hypertension. 1 year after randomization, both the gastric and sleeve gastrectomy patients had a large improvement or better remission according to the criteria stated in the study of type 2 diabetes. But what is really interesting to note that in spite of the effect of gastric bypass and sleeve gastrectomy in terms of diabetes control were similar, this effect was achieved in the gastric bypass group without medical therapy. As you can see, 18 over 49 patients in the sleeve gastrectomy group had remission of diabetes, and 21, the 42% in the gastric bypass. So no statistical difference in terms of diabetes remission was observed between gastric bypass and sleeve gastrectomy. However, all the patients in the gastric bypass arm achieved the diabetes remission without medical therapy. There was also significant a better effect in terms of weight loss from gastric bypass as respect to sleeve gastrectomy. While the effect on triglycerides were pronounced after both kind of operation. And it's clearly shown in this slide, in this, the time course of plasma glucose over time in the 1 year after the operation showed a better effect of gastric bypass than of sleeve gastrectomy. Again, it should be noticed that 78% of the gastric bypass patients had diabetes remission without medical therapy, as compared to 51% in the sleeve gastrectomy arm. Of course, the bariatric surgery has some early and late complications, so nothing is given for free. And indeed, in the sleeve gastrectomy group, there was some complication, in particular in the gastric bypass. There was the presence of a hernia and kidney stone later on, other than anemia. And in the sleeve gastrectomy group, there were also complications, metabolic complications, other than surgical complications. The metabolic complications were particularly correlated to cholelithiasis and to transfusion and anemia in particular. In our study, the primary endpoint was the proportion of patients who reached a good glycemic compensation in a fasting plasma glucose lower than 100 milligrams per deciliter in association with glycated hemoglobin lower than 6.5%, which on the semantic point of view means that these patients were no more diabetic at all. And always in the primary goal, there was that the patients should be without diabetes medication for at least 1 year, and the duration of the study was 2 years. The inclusion criteria were an age between 30 and 60 years, presence of frank type 2 diabetes with for more than 5 years, with glycated hemoglobin equals or higher than 7%, and the body mass index was chosen to be higher or equals to 35 kilograms per square meters, in agreement with the indication of the NIH Consensus Conference of 1991. And 72 subjects were screened, 60 found eligible for the study, and assigned 1:1:1 to the 3 arms of the study. So 18 completed the study in the medical treatment, 19 in the BPD arm, and 19 in the gastric bypass arm. At the beginning, at the baseline, there was no statistical difference between the variables investigated, with the exception of the lipid profile. As you can note, the gastric bypass patients had a better lipid profile than in the medical and biliopancreatic diversion arms. This because we chosen by protocol, by design of the study, to randomize all the patients who fulfilled the basal characteristic for the study, who came to our day hospital independently of the therapy for hypertension or hyperlipidemia that they were at the moment at baseline. The effect of biliopancreatic diversion in terms of diabetes remission, and this is the time course of glycated hemoglobin over time, was better for BPD than gastric bypass, although the power of the study was just powered to notice a significant difference between each surgical arm and the medical arm. So it was not powered to verify a difference between the two surgical groups. What we observed was that there was a large plasma glucose reduction, fasting plasma glucose reduction after both kind of bariatric surgery, although you can see that the plasma glucose was much lower after biliopancreatic diversion than after gastric bypass. And also glycated hemoglobin reached the lower levels after BPD than after gastric bypass, but in any way, both groups fulfilled the endpoint chosen for the study design. The cholesterol and triglycerides were drastically reduced principally after biliopancreatic diversion, which is not surprising because it is a malabsorptive bariatric operation. So we expected to see a large effect on triglycerides and cholesterol. While you can see that HDL cholesterol was significantly increased after gastric bypass only. This is another interesting characteristic of BPD, of gastric bypass. And blood pressure was not significantly different among the study groups, and weight loss was similar in the two surgical arms. We had early complications, in particular one incisional hernia after BPD. In fact, I have to point out that the kind of operation were made differently. It was an open surgery for BPD and a laparoscopic surgery for gastric bypass. But we studied the subjects after 1 year, so the bias due to the kind of operation was not more significant. And we had one intestinal occlusion after gastric bypass, so both patients were excluded by the study. And a late complication were metabolic complication, in particular iron deficiency anemia in both BPD and gastric bypass, and hypoalbuminemia after biliopancreatic diversion, as well as osteopenia and osteoporosis, in spite of vitamin D and calcium supplementation to these patients. It is important, I believe, to state that as shown by our study, the study of Philip Schauer, but also the SOS study published in August this year in the New England Journal of Medicine, that body mass index is not really important in in the remission of diabetes. I mean, it is not predictive, the baseline body mass index in terms of diabetes remission, which means that basically we cannot base our indication for bariatric surgery on body mass index only. Unfortunately, till now, we don't know which is the best predictor of remission of diabetes, which should be also one of the criterion criteria which we should use in the future for suggesting to the patients which kind of operation they should do. So, in general terms, we cannot say that the bariatric surgery in terms of diabetes remission is more indicated for a patients with a body mass index larger than 35 or with a body mass index of 27 or 30, which is really important in particular because the physician should suggest which kind of patients should undergo bariatric surgery. So this is one important point to discuss and to study in the future, at least in my opinion. Another important issue is that a large multicenter study should be performed in order to investigate the long-term effect of bariatric surgery in terms of diabetes remission, but also in terms of improvement of complications like microvascular complications or macrovascular complication, because indeed there are just very few studies published in the literature showing that a tight control obtained by bariatric surgery is able to improve microvascular disease, in particular renal complications in diabetic patients at 20 years, 15 years after the operations. So I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour cette étude qui montre clairement l'effet de la chirurgie bariatrique à 2 ans.
Yeah.
Chez des patients qui ont un BMI égal ou supérieur à 35, donc des obèses. La question qui est importante et qui nous occupe ce soir, c'est de savoir jusqu'à quel point on peut étendre les indications en dessous d'un BMI à 35. Est-ce qu'on peut le faire jusqu'à 30, jusqu'à 25 ? Madame Mingron a évoqué ce point. Alors, sans vous dévoiler l'avenir, je dis que j'ai la connaissance du fait que François Patou a lancé un PHRC en France, qui est en cours, avec des critères d'inclusion très sélectifs, qui permettra de répondre à cette question à des BMI plus bas, mais qui ne donnera la réponse que dans 5 ans minimum, si j'ai bien compris. Voilà le point. Vous avez compris ce que j'ai dit? J'ai parlé lentement, je sais que vous comprenez le français.
So.
The question has the time arrived to think about operating diabetic patients without thinking about BMI, or even in patients with lower BMI, 30?
You know, as I'm a physician, I'm an endocrinologist. So, in principle, I'd like to have some medical choice instead of surgical option. But as a scientist, I think that body mass index really, at this moment, is not a criterion for selection of the patients toward the bariatric surgery. And so patients with a body mass index lower are a good candidate if they have a decompensated type 2 diabetes. What is really interesting, at least in the future also, should be to discover the mechanism of action, which are really relevant in the improvement of insulin resistance, which is the main feature of type 2 diabetes. So should we discover why bariatric surgery improves insulin resistance and therefore determine a remission of diabetes, we could also have some choice, pharmacological choice for the treatment of these patients in alternative to bariatric operations.
Thank you. So I have also a general practical question. So here we are in a surgical academy together with our medical colleague too, but randomized study in surgery field is a very difficult task. So you did an incredible job. It's only 60 patients, but it's a New England paper because it's worth it. It's important, it's a major step just because you studied 60 patients. But how could you manage to have these patients accept what was the methodology, or not the tricks, but the methodology? We know how difficult it is because you will randomize patients. A, you are operated. B, you just not operated. So that's difficult for them to accept. How did it occur, and what happened?
We have a pretty long waiting list. So the patients know that they can wait 1, 2 years, even 3 years. So they didn't really have a problem if they are followed up very tightly by us. So we follow these patients very often. So the patients were happy to be followed by so tightly.
Okay. So the patient in the medical group will be maybe operated later on. Okay.
They will. In fact, we don't have that few patients in the medical group because they, of course, would like to be operated.
Thank you. Well, I think it's now time to move to the last session. Thank you very much indeed.